is Pham. So just to get us started, can you talk a little bit about how long have you been a teacher for? Do you enjoy teaching? What are your favorite aspects of teaching? And what kind of subject do you teach?
So I teach biology. When we start next year, it will be my 8th year teaching. I do love teaching, and what I love the most is seeing my students grow. And I think the most fulfilling part of my job is when students tell me they didn't really like science before because they thought it was hard. But then after taking my class, they actually find that they do enjoy science. They just didn't have an experience that was engaging to them before, but once they actually engage with actual science, I think science is for most people comes naturally, because I feel like all people are curious in some capacity, and science is kind of like a methodical way to address your curiosities. So I really love building that in my students, and so by the end of the year I like when they say they actually like science. So yeah, that's what I love.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. So with the pandemic, obviously a lot of our resources that you have been using as a teacher were not available to the students. So with science, a lot of experiments, labs are really crucial to the science classroom. And so how did you compensate for that in the virtual environment?
That was definitely the hardest part, because a lot of, the other parts of my class, like lectures and discussion, I felt like I was able to bridge that gap online. But the experiments is what gets people to, when I was talking about loving science and loving the process, I think that's what it is like lab experiments. So I did a couple of things. One route I took was to take some of the labs I did and do an easier, cheaper version of them, and I would send out lists to parents to try to get, and they would, basically, instead of doing it in a test tube, they could do it in like a mason jar. And I did a lot of that stuff this year, and tried to just simplify my labs as much as possible. And, instead of weighing with my official balance beam in class, they would just try to use this kitchen scale, things like that. So I tried to do some of that. I also use the website Labster, it provides virtual labs. There's also PhET simulations. So I did some virtual labs, and I did, cheapened labs at home.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So it sounds like you used a lot of new material. So kind of ed tech spaces on the internet to kind of supplement your teaching. And so with the pandemic, a lot of these new tools that you use, right? So how has virtual learning affected your teaching style? And do you think that way was harder or easier than in person?
I think that I definitely used a lot of new platforms like Labster and Nearpod, and Google Classroom a lot more. So I'm in a unique position because I know a lot of teachers in my placement before this pandemic, they were kind of thrown into using tech. But before I came to my current placement, at a former school, I actually worked at a blended learning school, which really emphasizes the use of technology. So even back then, each student had a Chromebook, and we did a lot of stuff online. So but when I came to my new placement, that wasn't really the culture of the school. And I tried to do some stuff with the computer, but it didn't really go well. Students couldn't do their homework. So I'm hoping actually with, since the pandemic, the district provided Chromebooks for each of the students. And now that I think they're used to it, I hope I can go back to using more tech, because I think now that it's kind of embedded and everyone dipped their toes in the water already. So I can more so expect students to be able to do homework on the Chromebook and things like that.
Super interesting. Moving on to a different subject. So you mentioned earlier that you really like interacting with students. So during the pandemic, obviously that kind of connection was really hard to find on an online environment. So how did you connect with your students online? How do you want to continue learning from this experience as we go on to in-person?
It definitely was harder to connect because it's in person, you obviously just walk around and sometimes natural conversations pop up, or my students would pop by and eat at lunch or after school. So it's just a lot more natural. And then with the virtual space, I really had to make planned times where it would be so I hosted office hours pretty much every day, Monday through Thursday, and this would be like a time where it was like less formal, that I didn't have to get through all this coursework. And I had some kids, drop in and just chat during office hours. So that was like one way to build the relationship. But I definitely think for the vast majority, it was harder to build, that relationship that kind of just naturally pops up in class, because they can just drop by and we can chat. However, because I used like platforms like Nearpod and also chatting, I do think I actually got to hear a lot more from my really quiet students who would have never said a word in class. And I've got to see their thoughts a bit more. So that's the main reason why I want to continue using Nearpod. I think I can get a gauge from my quieter students, because usually when I ask for volunteers in class, and the people who are talking are always the extroverted ones. And I feel like I actually got to know some of my introverted students. I wouldn't say like on a personal level, but more so like I could see what they were thinking about the lesson and just more so understand their thoughts. So that's why I kind of want to use some of these platforms where instead of having to talk, they can, like chat to me and type things in class, and I can project it and continue that. But mixing with, real life interaction, I think would be strong.
Do you think being online has changed the future of in-person instruction? And if so, how?
Definitely think so. So as I mentioned before, I definitely see myself continuing to use these platforms in my class that gave me really quick data that I wasn't able to get before. So just being able to shoot out a quick multiple choice question and seeing where my students are at was really useful, and I could see it in real time. I definitely want to continue using those, because how it used to be is you would walk around and try to talk to students, and then you would get like a gauge and it's like a feeling. But I'm a science teacher. I like science and I like data, so I want some real solid data, and I can say exactly like 78% of the class gets it right now. I know exactly who does not get it, so I can talk to them independently. And I've tried to do stuff like that without tech. There's something called clickers where it's still tech, because I need to use my technology to do it. So it's like a QR code that they turn. It's just a little bit slower, so I want to continue doing that. And I hope that now that for the majority of students had, some experience using tech. At the beginning of the year, it was kind of hard to explain like every single platform to everyone. And there would always be like maybe 5 students per class who really struggled in it. But I think that this past year, students learned so much on how to use different platforms. And by the end of the year, I really was able to introduce like new things without it being, explaining how to click. So I hope that this carries through, and that, I think their learning experience will be a lot more enriching and full if we could continue using tech, and I could continue like getting quick data on what they know and they don't know.
Going along the same lines, what were the biggest wins you had in the pandemic?
Biggest wins for my students. So I asked them to give me feedback at the end of the year, and they said that I was actually able to make it feel like a real class, which was my goal. So not everyone, but a lot said that they were able, like I was able to make it feel a bit normal and make it feel like a real class, which I really did a lot of stuff to do to try to do that. And a lot of platforms like helped me do that. But I was most concerned with that. I also think that the pandemic was obviously hard for everyone, and trying to learn when you're stressed is very hard. So I definitely changed my policies in late work and things like that, and focused on whatever the student can do whenever they can. And I think, some kids appreciated that. So, I think being able to produce some feeling of normalcy online felt like a win. So.
Was that also something the most challenging, you think, from being online, like finding that kind of normalcy that would never be exactly like the classroom, but still having something very similar to the normal classroom? Do you think that was like the hardest part of teaching online?
Yeah, definitely. I have to make that and accept that. So make some sacrifices and accept that. But how am I going to make this as engaging as possible through a screen? And so everything I did, I really had to consider that, and how am I going to make this feel a bit like more real as it would be in class, like when you move to your lab tables and talk. So I had like virtual slides where it would show lab tables and be like, let's move to our lab groups, and try to just make it feel a bit more real.
As we transition back to in-person classes, the grade expectations will definitely change. I think being online had inflated a lot of grades. And so how do you handle grade expectations as we transition back to in-person classes?
I would stick by this rule whether or not we were in a pandemic. I also did it during the pandemic, but just like every single assignment, I'm very explicit by how this will impact your grade. I do like categories, so the projects and assessments are weighted more than homework assignments. And so I want to be able to explain to my students every single time. So sometimes they're confused, like, oh, I did all my homework, why is my grade like this? And I have to explain, you have to do some test corrections or projects because they're different buckets. And for every assignment, especially at the beginning of the year, I think starting second semester, I have to do less of it. And I can just say it's going into this bucket, so you got to know that it weighs more. But especially at the beginning of the year, I will explain this is going to be heavy on your grade, or because this is the first test, if you get a low grade, it's going to show this. And just to be very explicit, I don't want to sound threatening. I just want to be honest, like, this is worth a lot of your grade. So, and I've always done that. So I will continue to do that. And yeah, I agree that grades were probably inflated last year because, everyone was rightfully so being, compassionate that it's a pandemic and people are struggling at home. But I think we'll gradually, I feel like we're not totally out of the woods. So they're now transitioning back. So that will also be an emotional struggle, but gradually coming back to normalcy and taking up our rigor again. But I feel probably not right at the beginning of the year, but gradually throughout the year. So.
Right. Yeah. So kind of having that staggered progression back into normalcy, I think would be really helpful for both the teachers and the students.
Yeah.
So I'm nearing the end of our interview, and I just want to ask some last minute fun speed run questions. So the first question is, what is your favorite lab or experiment to do as a biology teacher?
Probably just the frog dissection. It's a classic, but I love how some students are so crazy about it, and they're actually, it's the most exciting thing in the year.
Right.
And so totally disgusted, and they're so the range of emotions is so wide there, and it's just fun for me to see, and it's a classic. So.
Yeah, definitely. So what's something that you want your students to know about you or teachers in general? What do you think is kind of a misconception that they have about teachers? Could be something about you struggled through in the pandemic, could be something about in-person learning, anything.
I hope that the majority of my students know this, but I guess about teachers in general, I feel like people signed up to be a teacher because they really do want the best for their students and they want to see them succeed. With that being said, a lot of people express that in different ways, and I guess even if a teacher is strict, which I wouldn't say, I'm probably not on the strict side, but even if a teacher is strict, they're doing it for the best because they want to see students grow and be successful. And I think that's an assumption that everyone can make. I think knowing all of my colleagues, I don't think any of them don't want that. So yeah, I just wish students will understand that, I guess. So yeah,
definitely. So the last question, just to wrap everything up, what are you most looking forward to as we return back to in-person learning?
Yeah, I'm just looking forward to the little things, like I mentioned, just being able to walk by and have a natural conversation without it being a planned Zoom. So, and just seeing the kids at lunch again, I'm just excited for that. I'm just excited for the little things, and I guess the pandemic made me appreciate that more. Yeah,
just seeing their faces, kind of seeing the adolescent, experience. Perfect. Thank you so much, Ms. Pham, for this interview.